The original intention was to talk to you about the fisherman disciples tonight. For some reason, I thought there were only 5, and there are actually 7. So instead of trying to squeeze so many people into one lesson, I changed it to talking about the brother disciples. They were all fishermen, but because they are the primary leaders of the 12, I'm going to keep them separate. We're talking about Andrew and Peter, along with James and John. And though they were from 2 different families, they are believed to be cousins. At least one, if not all, were followers of John the Baptist. But first, I'd like to set the scene with the things they all had in common. These 4 were in business together. They were successful fishing partners. Mark 1:20 tells us they even had hired men. It is clear that they learned this from their fathers, and Scripture makes reference to fishing with Zebedee, the father of James and John. They came from the Capernaum area on the north end of the Sea of Galilee, where fish were very abundant. A question arises, though, did Jesus pick them because they were fishermen? Or did he tell fishing stories because they would understand? Believe it or not, fishing was not a common trade for Jews in the Bible. The Sea of Galilee lent itself to productive opportunities, though, and what you may not know is that as much time was spent with their nets as actually fishing. The nets were made out of linen and needed constant repair and cleaning, or they would rot. Luke 5:2 reinforces this. The fishermen often fished at night, and the industry was 12 months a year. Their boats would have been 23 feet by 7 feet with a crew of 5. 4 to row, 1 to supervise and steer. Or they could carry 11 to 13 passengers. They could hold half a ton of fish. So when we hear that the boats couldn't hold all the fish that came in the nets, that's how many fish we're talking about. And there were primarily 3 types of fish in the Sea of Galilee. St. Peter's fish, which obviously wasn't the name of them back then. Today we would call them tilapia. Biny fish, or carp, and then sardines. But their sardines weren't those little bitty things we eat in cans today. Fish was the most common protein mentioned in the Gospels. These 4 fishermen were quite intelligent, speaking at least 3 or more languages to be able to sell and trade. They needed to understand numbers to successfully run a business. After paying taxes and wages, they still made a decent living. Walking away from their job was no small decision. They were all clearly leaders, which we'll find out could cause some issues. I'm going to begin with Andrew. He was the first disciple, after all, and he was the older brother. His name means manly, which makes sense for someone with such a physical job. Andrew kind of took a back seat to his younger brother, Peter, and some go so far as to say he lived in his brother's shadow. Yet Andrew doesn't ever seem to show any resentment for that. He was the one who introduced Peter to Jesus, and that tended to be his role, one of bringing people to Jesus. Andrew also brought the boy with the lunch to Jesus. I like to think it's a testimony to his faith that Jesus would do what he said, and actually did feed 5,000 with this boy's lunch. Andrew also brought the Greeks to Jesus in John 12:20 to 22. Philip initially brought the Greeks to Andrew, and then Andrew, I think, fulfilled his role as kind of a personal secretary to Jesus, and he then brought the Greeks to Jesus. Now, Andrew did not write a book or preach to crowds from what we can tell, but he was the first to hear and the first to follow Christ. Now, history says he died at the hands of a governor who was angry that his own wife became a Christian. And we're told that it was a long death, 2 days, and that he witnessed 2 people that passed by the entire time. He hung on a cross, and many of you know that the crosses were put on the highways as examples to people passing by. And we are told that Andrew witnessed to people about Jesus. Now we'll talk about his famous brother Peter. Some people say his mouth was shaped like his foot because there were a number of times he spoke out of turn. We believe Peter was the leader of the pack because he's always mentioned first when the Bible lists the disciples. Matthew 16:18 is an example of that. He was also told by Jesus that that God would build his church on Peter, and he seemed to be the leader at Pentecost and other times after that. Despite this attitude, Peter needed direction from his peers at times, including changing his attitude about the Gentiles. Now his given name was Simon, and it was a very common name. His birth name, according to Matthew 16:7, was Simon Bar Jonah, or Simon son of Jonah. Jonah could also have been John or Jonas. Peter was also called a rock in Luke 6:14, and that's what Cephas means. That is also what Peter means, rock. When you read the Gospels moving forward, pay special attention to the name used. When Jesus called him Simon, it was the old worldly Peter. And when he used Peter, he was talking to the new man with a new faith. Now, as was mentioned in a previous message, Peter was married. Luke 4:38, we see his mother-in-law was healed. 1 Corinthians 9:5 also tells us his wife traveled with him on the mission field. And because of this, it is speculated that they had no children or that the children were grown. As young as Peter was when Jesus called him to the ministry, the first makes more sense. Peter is felt by some to be the greatest preacher because of the books of Acts. Yet Peter was undependable with poor follow-through. You could use words like impetuous and impulsive, or even overeager. John 21:3 is a great example of a lack of patience when instead of waiting for Jesus' directions, he decided to go back to fishing. And that incident, when they came back after fishing, there's Jesus on the shore cooking breakfast for them the next morning. This 3-time denier of his relationship with Jesus brought him to a point of having to say 3 times how much he loved Jesus. Again, all of that is in John 21. Now, Jesus forewarned him that he, Peter, would be a martyr, and that's in John 21 as well. The story goes that his wife was crucified first, and that Peter didn't feel worthy to die like his Lord, so he died upside down on a cross. The next person we're going to cover is James. James means passion. The name was Jacob in the Old Testament, and he, like Andrew, lived in his brother's shadow. He was actually the older of the two. Unlike Andrew, who was the first disciple, he was the first of the disciples to be martyred. We know this from Acts 12:1-3. He died by Herod's orders, by the sword, which meant he was beheaded just like John the Baptist was. Now, these brothers were the sons of Zebedee, and it is assumed that the family either had prominence or money or both. Some speculate that Zebedee may have been in the Levite clan, or at least knew the high priest, and that's how Peter would have gained entrance to the courtyard where he denied Jesus. There was clearly an inner circle of disciples, and James would have been part of that, being second to Peter. He was one of the disciples present at Gethsemane, where Jesus prayed before his death. Now, this pair of brothers were also known as sons of thunder. And that was a negative phrase. Luke 9:54 tells us how they wanted to call down fire from heaven on Samaria. And it said that James and John were overconfident, ambitious, passionate, outspoken, and impatient with evil. They have been equated to Elijah, who did call down fire from heaven, and Nehemiah, who was passionate for God's people. I can't move on without mentioning their mother, the first helicopter mom, as I heard one person refer to her. In Matthew 20, verses 20 to 24, she asked for special seating in heaven for her boys. But because Mark 16:1 tells the story just a little differently, some believe her boys put her up to it. Her name was Salome. Now, if Andrew was manly and Peter was the rock, and James was passionate in his faith, the last brother, John, symbolizes love. John was the most prominent writer of the group, having written a gospel, 3 epistles or letters, and the book of Revelation. John's personality was similar to that of his brothers, being called brash, aggressive, narrow-minded, to name a few. John was a very black and white person in his writings. There is no fence sitting for him, as he wrote in absolutes. Paul, on the other hand, seemed to address all the exceptions the early churches were facing. John grew into a man of balance, though. He knew that truth needs love. He learned that ambition needs humility. And as the longest living disciple, he saw that suffering leads to glory. John 13:23 tells us that this is the disciple that Jesus loved. He certainly trusted him enough to ask him to care for his mother Mary after his death in John 19:27. But I would argue that God's love for John can be our love if we can find it and grab onto it. I don't want you to think, though, that John wasn't strong in his faith. He ends many of his writings with confidence in Jesus' second coming. If there is a lesson to be learned from these men, it's this. It doesn't matter your birth order. It doesn't matter your personality flaws. It doesn't matter your parents. It doesn't matter how visible you are as a leader. In other words, it doesn't matter who you are or what you do, but what you are. And Jesus changes us. We are his miracles. We look for the things he does, the way he heals and fixes. But we are his best miracles.